I really have my work cut out for me this evening. The assumption among all the scholarly community and those who listen to them is that Genesis in the flood account of Noah is borrowed. It's borrowed from older Sumerian and or Akkadian mythology because those accounts, those mythologies have their own Noah type figure, either called Atra-Hasis if you are an Akkadian or Ziusudra if you are a Sumerian. And there's a little bit of a disagreement about who they are. The Sumerians claim that he was from Shrupak, but he was actually one of their kings. And the Akkadians say that he was the son of a king of Shrupak. But the city of Shrupak is agreed in both accounts that that is the source of the Noah figure. And so the earliest we have of those two accounts is from the 17th century BC. And that's early. And then the Epic of Gilgamesh has a different name for the same figure, but it sort of just finds him and he's recalling his memories. So the other two are sort of an account of what happened, much like the Genesis account, but the Epic of Gilgamesh refers back to the same story, but it came along much later. However, the scholarly consensus is that the book of Genesis came much later, say from the 5th to the 10th century BC, as opposed to, we know those other two stories were around in the 17th century BC. And of course, they discount the idea of Mosaic authorship, but what they say here is, even if you grant Mosaic authorship, Moses, when was Moses? The earliest date for Moses, when he would have written this account, would be the end of the 15th century BC, maybe, or the 14th century BC. Either the end of the 14th century BC or somewhere in the 13th century BC, and the early dates would even put him, maybe a little earlier than that, but somewhere in that range. So any way you look at it, 200 to 400 years before Moses, if Moses was a historical figure, which they will contest you on, but let's say even if he was a historical figure, the other accounts, we know there is extinct. 200, 300 years before that, and possibly longer, because it's unlikely the account that we found in the ruins of Mesopotamia was the first one of those accounts ever written. It's just the ones we found in the library of these big cities we're excavating. And so people look at that, not just scholars, but ordinary people that are interested in the Bible, and they study that, and they go, oh, that's it then. Genesis, it was not first. The other ones came first, and it really looks like Genesis borrowed from these accounts. But I'm going to put forth a hypothesis whereby Genesis is not borrowing from these accounts, where Genesis is either first or contemporary with these other stories, and probably first in the sense that they're all recounting the same events, but which one is likely to be less distorted. Now, although this seems like checkmate, if you consider where Moses got Genesis from, you have a couple of possibilities. And if you concede Mosaic authorship, and again, they were saying, well, these other stories are from before even the time Moses was purported to be here, so therefore they're older. Well, they're older if Moses made those stories up for the first time. They're older if God didn't tell Moses about things that had happened from before that time, which is the traditional version. But I have another idea, a better idea. It's not my idea. It's the Wiseman hypothesis, or the tablet theory, that the first 36 chapters of Genesis are, Moses didn't get that anew. He had some idea of his family's history. Just like in Acadia, they had tablets, and in Sumeria, they had tablets. His people from that same area had tablets recording their family history. And the tablet theory, there's what they call a Toledoth phrase in these tablets. These are the generations of, which really means this is the account of. And that phrase appears 11 times in early Genesis. It quits appearing about the time Moses could rely on word of mouth from his immediate ancestors. It quit. But before that, they have this same form of phrase that you saw in ancient Near Eastern tablets to conclude an account. And so the idea is, and it's fleshed out more in my book, that Moses had tablets. He didn't come up with this story anew. He didn't borrow it from other existing sources. He had his own source, tablets from his ancestors. He had, along with the heirlooms of his people. And that's why, they had papyrus by then. But yet he went to the mountain, and what did he come down with? The 10 Commandments on tablets. Why? Were they used to seeing sacred documents in tablet form? Perhaps so. And this would be the ultimate sacred document, the 10 Commandments. But the idea is, in the tablet theory, Moses, just like this wasn't the day he was born. He took his family's history and he transcribed it and made it into the first Torah. So it doesn't matter if Moses came after those other accounts. If I had gotten an account from my ancestors and I took those accounts and I put them together in an anthology, then it doesn't matter that I'm younger than the events described in the anthology. I got the information from records from my ancestors. And that's what Moses would get in the tablet theory. And the scholars, basically, they took the most rigid and inflexible form of the tablet theory and came up with a couple of things that would undermine that version of it, and then said the whole thing's nonsense and we're not going to talk about it again. And they don't. They don't talk about it again. They need to talk about it again, because until they show why the tablet theory, a lot of data points fit together in the tablet theory. And until they can show why it's implausible, we need to keep asking them about it and not let them dodge and hide and refuse to talk about it like they've been doing. With just a few minor tweaks, all their objections to the tablet theory are overcome. If they want to be scholars, if they want to do research, if they want to explore the ideas with a couple of these tweaks. The tablet theory is the best explanation for the first 36 chapters of Genesis. So, if Moses is an historical figure, he very likely had these tablets from prior generations telling his family history. And that would bring somebody to, I think, a logical objection. Well, we can only go by what we have, and what we have is these other tablets we found are very old. Atra-Hasis, that's old. We have that from 17th century BC. We don't have that for Genesis until the 6th or 7th century BC. So we're talking about a 1,000-year period there. Why do you assume that the one account is at least as old as the other? Why do you assume that Genesis is as old as this account we've seen for 1,000 years? And I would ask you, what would you expect to find? And in other words, I understand that I'm arguing from absence of evidence, but would you expect to find the Hebrew version of this, the version handed down from Abraham to his descendants? Would you expect to find it as easily as you would find the Akkadian and Sumerian versions? Did the Hebrews build big cities? Did the Hebrews have kings that sort of built elaborate structures and palaces and libraries and monuments that are easy for archaeologists to find? And like, okay, the tablets would be here because this is where the palace is. No, they didn't do any of those things. And at some point, they went to Egypt and they learned how to put things on papyrus scrolls, a superior medium. So I would argue that you're dealing with an empire or a city-state versus a wandering tribe, a wandering family. And there was probably some debate in the family about who got the heirlooms, who got the tablets, but once one branch of the family got it, the others didn't have it. And so that account, you would not expect that version of the account to be as widely dispersed, and you wouldn't expect it to be as easy to find as you would with kings that built palaces. So it's true you do not find the Genesis account as early, but you wouldn't expect it to find it as early, just because of the nature of the lifestyle of the nomadic Hebrews, the nomadic people of Abraham, versus the settled city life in the plains of Mesopotamia. So that's a possible reason why you don't find the Genesis account as far back. You would not expect to. That brings us to the next issue. Okay, Mark, why is the Genesis account the accurate one and the accounts from Mesopotamia that largely agree, why are they wrong? Who changed? Why are you saying that they changed and not Genesis? Well, again, let's look at the way the cultures treated their accounts. In Mesopotamia, it was all politicized. They would change the name of their gods. They would conquer another city or merge with another city, and their sacred stories would be retold where the two gods were somehow related. Or now that was, the old god was the sky god, but now it's Marduk is taking over, and he was his heir or what have you. So, excuse me, it is well known. We've caught them changing their stories, changing their sacred accounts. I'm speaking here of the Mesopotamians. Even Atra-Hasis and Ziusudra, they are differ in the details. They're both from the same city, but is trying to claim credit for him on their list and some of their propaganda, and the Akkadians are trying to claim credit for him on theirs. And there's some details are different about who he is, even in those two accounts, even though the overall stories are super similar. So I would suggest that we know the Mesopotamians changed their accounts at a whim. As the winds of politics blew, they would alter their accounts accordingly. And we see a progression of that. Now, how did the Hebrews treat these records? Well, they treated them as absolutely sacred. What Moses wrote and what Moses said was absolute. When he wrote a law, he wrote the law of Moses. And if someone violated that law, they were subject to being brutally executed. That's if they broke what was written in the word. What if they were found forging the word or making the word up, or changing the word? You see what I'm saying? What helps the Hebrews' case that they aren't the ones who changed it is how seriously they took it, and how while the other guys, they took it, they just used it and manipulated it and changed it at a whim, whereas the Hebrews took tremendous pains to copy things exactly. I mean, when they were copying their scrolls, if they made a mistake, could be 800 pages into it. They didn't have pages back then, but you know what I mean. They have to destroy the whole scroll. Oh, you messed up. And that's how they faithfully reproduced the Torah time after time after time. That's a culture that's not going to take great liberties with the text. Unlike what we know, we already have the proof. The Mesopotamians did that. They altered their accounts. So it's like you have a conflict in stories between a couple of known liars and someone who has a reputation for being very scrupulously exact and honest. Who are you going to believe? I believe the ones that they have that history of really respecting what the word says. Another point in the favor of Genesis being the older version is its honesty about who we are. In the Akkadian and Sumerian versions, in both of them, the gods are very capricious. The gods are they have bad moral character. They don't have a high regard for human life. It isn't because that man is wicked that they want to wipe out mankind, but man is just too noisy. Now, isn't that exactly the way humans would change the narrative, to sort of blame shift from us to God? And the narrative in Genesis is the Adamic people were filling the earth with bloodshed. There was violence everywhere. And God didn't want them to ruin the earth, so he used the earth to ruin them. And that's the narrative. Whereas in the other two accounts, it isn't that God is just and humans are sinful and God has to wipe mankind out to protect the rest of his creation, which they are corrupting. Instead, the gods are just inconvenienced by man. We don't do anything wrong. We're just being too noisy just because we're populating so much. And so if you really are just honest with ourselves about what kind of version would came first and what human beings would do to the story, I can see the original story being one that made us look bad, because really that is our current condition. Our current condition is one of unholiness. Our current condition is one where we are a threat to destroy our environment if we misbehave too badly. And that strikes me as true. If you're really honest with yourself, it really strikes a chord. Yeah, that's what humanity can be like, and that's what humanity can do. So compare that to the Akkadian and Sumerian versions where it's the gods that are being unreasonable. It's the gods that just don't want to be bothered with the noise. They have sort of a very selfish, childish, immature reason for wanting to wipe mankind out. And then they immediately regret it. As soon as that happens, they're like, okay, now who's going to do all the work that we had man doing for us? Oh my goodness, we've made such a mistake. Let's see. Good. Ea saved them. Enki, depending on which version you say, Enki, Ea, same deity. And by the way, Ea is the same way you pronounce the shortened version of the God of the Old Testament. It's the term Ea is used to refer to God in the Bible like 49 times or something. So it really is. These are distortions of the same story. But who's doing the distorting? I say it's the people who aren't being honest about people. They're not being honest about themselves and mankind's true condition versus the ones who are. In conclusion, I know a superficial look at the evidence would lead one to think that the Babylonian, the Sumerian and the Akkadian accounts came before Genesis. But before I'm ready to concede that, and before you should concede it, the alternative hypothesis should be explored. The tablet theory should be explored. And it has not been. They haven't looked at the tablet theory and discredited it with things that make sense if you tweak the tablet theory just a little bit, as I've described in my book. They haven't done that. They haven't done the scholarship. They haven't done the research. And so they should not be so reluctant to try to take that on. But my experience is the scholars have been. They just boycott it, refuse to think about it. And that's wrong, especially if you're going to insist that Genesis came later. Well, if you're going to insist that, prove it. Show us. Your scholars, do the work. They haven't done it. And so that's one thing that's important. We need to find out if the tablet theory is credible or not. Not just because they turn their noses up and don't want to think about it. I want the reason why. The reason. Show us the evidence. Number two, you can't, it rings more true. The story in Genesis rings more true than these other accounts that we know they altered their accounts for political reasons. So why wouldn't this just be an original account that was altered like they did all their other stories about gods and goddesses? So it is possible that these other accounts are older than Genesis. We have documents from them. We have tablets from that tell the stories that are older than anything we found with the account in Genesis on it. But that's what we would expect to find. That is not a surprise finding, and therefore it doesn't prove anything. Because if you only find what you expect to find, if you don't expect to find Genesis to be as far back, because of the nature of the culture and the nature of these tablets being sort of a family document rather than put into a government facility, which is where the other tablets, the Akkadian and Sumerian tablets, are in government facilities. Now, what's the one thing we know about governments throughout history? They lie. right? It's like Otto von Bismarck said, never believe anything until it's been officially denied. So they're good at preserving their own narrative and trumpeting their own narrative. They're big and they're loud. It's just like governments today. They seize control of the microphones and they blast their narrative. But it's not likely to be the true narrative. The real narrative is one that exposes the false narrative of the government story and is quieter, and you have to look for it to find it a little bit because it's not being pushed by the ones in power. So I think the same thing is going on here with Genesis. I think you had some family records. They wound up with Abraham. They wound up with his descendants. They wound up with Moses, and that's what he used to make the book of Genesis. The scholars keep saying we should interpret these records the way the people of the day would interpret them. Well, with the Toledoth phrases in Genesis, 11 Toledoth phrases indicating the end of an ancient account, I submit to you that the ancient reader would consider Genesis to be, early Genesis, first 36 chapters, a series of accounts, ancient accounts strung together. That's what they would interpret that book as being, the first 36 chapters. So if we're going to see it the way they see it, let's see it like that. In which case, Moses could have been using records that were old even in his day. I do not concede that these other accounts were before Genesis. You guys, I'm sitting in Missouri as I make this. You got to show me. Thank you for listening, and may God bless you.